Battle of Dunkirk, May–June 1940. Not every victory means you won a battle. Sometimes a victory can be a well-executed retreat, and that's exactly what happened during the Battle of Dunkirk in late May 1940. With the expeditious collapse of French resistance against German forces during the Battle of France, British troops found themselves trapped in Dunkirk, a town in northern France. A massive effort of both military and civilian vessels successfully ferried 338,000 British Expeditionary Force members across the Channel to Britain. The maneuver became known as the Miracle at Dunkirk, and it proved a powerful rallying cry for the dark days ahead. The greatest aid in the Allies' escape strangely came from Adolf Hitler himself, who, likely fearing an Allied counterattack, halted Nazi armored forces bearing down on Dunkirk for 2 days. Those 48 hours were vital in the Allied effort to rescue the soldiers cornered on the European continent. Although buoyed by the retreat, Winston Churchill also countered with a dose of reality that hard fighting was still ahead, saying we must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. Battle of Okinawa, April–June 1945. On Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945, the last major battle of the global conflagration known as World War II began on the island of Okinawa, some 400 miles south of mainland Japan. As part of Operation Iceberg, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Okinawa in the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. As the US and its allies pushed relentlessly toward the Japanese mainland, they first needed to conquer Ryukyu and Okinawa Islands, and Japanese commanders knew if the islands fell, the country's populated mainland would be next. The battle for the islands lasted nearly 3 months, and is known today as a typhoon of steel because of the fierce fighting. On April 7, U.S. carrier-based bombers sunk the Japanese battleship Yamato, considered to be one of the most powerful ships in the world. The bombers killed more than 2,000 of Yamato's crew. Eventually, Japan lost some 110,000 men in the battle. The Allied victory put Japan in striking distance of enemy artillery, but instead of risking a land assault, President Harry S. Truman dropped 2 atomic bombs and ended the war for good. Battle of Bhutan, January–April 1942. After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Japanese launched a major offensive in the Philippines that eventually led to U.S. forces and soldiers of the Philippine Commonwealth to be cornered on the Bhutan Peninsula in the Philippines. Under direct orders from President Franklin Roosevelt, a reluctant General Douglas MacArthur escaped from Bhutan to Australia, vowing one day to return and continue the fight. Allied forces held off Japanese troops for 3 months, which stymied Japan's hopes of growing its territorial gains in the Pacific theater. However, on April 9, 1942, 76,000 Allied troops surrendered to the Imperial Japanese Army. The transfer of those POWs from the battle became known as the Bhutan Death March due to the physical abuse and arbitrary killings of prisoners along the way. Remember Bhutan became a popular rallying cry for the U.S. war effort. Battle of Tulagi and Gavutu, Itanambogo, August 1942. During the Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 to February 1943, the Battle of Tulagi and Gavutu, Tanambogo, all small islands in the Solomons, became a grim prelude to the fierce island-hopping battles ahead. While the Allied land forces fighting on nearby Guadalcanal faced much less resistance, U.S. forces on these other 3 islands were met by an outnumbered Japanese force that fought to protect the island to the last man. This fierce, almost suicidal Japanese resistance was common throughout the rest of the war in the Pacific, and Americans got their first taste of it on the remote island of Tulagi. Second Battle of El Alamein, October, in November 1942. With its conclusion nearly coinciding with Operation Torch in November 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein put an end to Edwin Rommel, aka the Desert Fox, and his offensive in the Western Desert Campaign. The hard-fought British victory stopped Germany's advance into Egypt, and even inspired Prime Minister Winston Churchill to say, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." German and Italian troops suffered a decisive defeat by the British Eighth Army. But in the months leading up to the battle, it appeared Rommel, who was well adapted to desert warfare, would soon spill into the Middle East and conquer the region. British forces put a stop to Rommel's plans, and decisively shifted the momentum of the North African campaign. After years of crushing setbacks and defeats, the Second Battle of El Alamein gave the United Kingdom a much-needed shot of morale. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Although the US was not in a state of war during the surprise attack on its naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, then a US territory, Pearl Harbor is one of the most consequential battles of World War II. That's because it motivated the United States, then only tangentially involved in the conflict, to become a full-fledged enemy of the Axis powers. Just before 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft attacked the Pacific Naval Base, damaging 8 battleships and killing 2,403 Americans. Luckily, the US's aircraft carriers, which would go on to prove vital to the war effort in the Pacific, were not at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. Because the attack was launched without any declaration of war, the attack on Pearl Harbor was eventually tried as a war crime at the Tokyo trials in 1946. Operation Bagration, June–August 1944. Victory in Europe could never have been achieved if not for the sacrifice of the Soviet Union in the Eastern Front. One of the Red Army's major offensives came in the summer of 1944, and went by the name Operation Bagration. The offensive followed the events of D-Day on the Western Front, and aimed to exact revenge for the Soviet losses suffered during the German blitzkrieg known as Operation Barbarossa 3 years earlier. Soviet forces gathered 166 divisions on the Belarusian front, and attacked along a 450-mile expanse. The attack was so swift that the Red Army sometimes advanced as much as 15 miles a day. Although caught by surprise, the Germans still exacted a terrible price as Soviet forces suffered nearly 750,000 casualties during the 2-month-long operation. But Operation Bagration was soon seen as the death knell of Nazi Germany. Operation Torch, November 1942. Led by Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower, 33,000 U.S. troops landed on the shores of North Africa as part of a multi-pronged battle known as Operation Torch. In an attempt to dislodge Nazi Germany's hold on the French North African coast and open up the Mediterranean to the Allies, Operation Torch was also the first time U.S. troops saw combat against Germany in World War II. On November 8, 1942, troops landed in Casablanca, Algiers, and Iran with mild resistance. By the end of the month, Allied forces were planning their assault on Tunis in Tunisia. The Allies had officially opened up another front in the war in Northern Africa, a key demand of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Battle of Narva, February–August 1944. This Battle of Narva is not to be confused with the other Battle of Narva that occurred between 1700 and 1720, one during the Great Northern War, although both were fought in Narva, Estonia. The World War II Battle of Narva saw Germany and the Leningrad front vying to control Narva Isthmus. The battle consisted of 2 phases, the Battle for Narva Bridgehead and the Battle of Tannenberg Line. The USSR, Stalin in particular, wanted to take control of Estonia and use strategic locations in the country to attack Finland and Prussia via sea and air. German forces held their own and hampered the USSR's attempts to build a stronghold in Narva. Both sides lost more than 500,000 soldiers combined. The Siege of Leningrad, September 1941 to January 1944. The Siege of Leningrad, also known as the 900-day siege, since it nearly lasted that long, in actuality, it lasted 872 days, occurred when German and Finnish forces surrounded Leningrad and took over the city. The Soviet government had its citizenry work on building fortifications throughout the city, although the area was almost entirely encircled by invading forces by November. The siege claimed more than 650,000 Soviet lives in a single year alone due to starvation, disease, and shelling. Battle of Crete, May 1941. One of the most audacious operations in the German conquest of Europe was the air assault on the Greek island of Crete, the first action in which paratroopers were dropped in large numbers. Crete was defended by British and Greek forces who had some success against the lightly armed German soldiers jumping out of the sky. However, delays and communication failures between Allies allowed the Germans to capture the vital airfield at Malem and fly in reinforcements. Once the Nazis gained air superiority, landings by sea followed. The Allies surrendered after 2 weeks of fighting. Battle of Anzio, January–June 1944. The Allies invaded Italy in 1943, but by 1944, they had progressed only as far as the Gustav Line south of Rome. So, the Allies staged a massive amphibious operation to force the defenders to split their forces or be surrounded, but quick success depended on a rapid break out from the beachhead. Some 36,000 men landed to the enemy's considerable surprise, but while the Allies consolidated, the Germans surrounded the area with equivalent forces and dug defensive positions. In February, after heavy fighting and failed advances, the Allies were pushed back almost to the beachhead. It took over 100,000 more reinforcements and 5 months of fighting to finally break out of Anzio. Battle of the Bulge, December 1944 to January 1945. Following the D-Day invasion of June 1944, the Allies broke out of Normandy and advanced rapidly across France and Belgium. Hitler aimed to halt them through a surprise blitzkrieg. Several armored divisions massed in the Ardennes with the goal of breaking through Allied lines. American forces held on stubbornly in spite of heavy casualties, more than 19,000 died. The Germans had limited supplies, and could only fight for a few days before fuel and ammunition ran out, so the offensive soon ran out of steam. Allied lines bulged, but did not break, and hundreds of thousands of reinforcements poured into the area. Afterward, Germany lacked resources for another offensive. The end was inevitable. Battle of Monte Cassino, January–May 1944. After Anzio, the Germans occupied defensive positions known as the Winter Line, consisting of bunkers, barbed wire, minefields, and ditches. The 4 successive Allied assaults on these positions became known as the Battle of Monte Cassino. The fight resembled a World War I battle, with artillery bombardments preceding bloody infantry assaults on fixed positions. Success was bought at the cost of more than 50,000 casualties on the Allied side. Today, the battle is mainly remembered for the destruction of the Abbey of Monte Cassino, which was sheltering civilians, by more than 100 B-17 flying fortresses, when the Allies mistakenly believed the Abbey to be a German artillery observation position. Battle of Britain, July–October 1940. By late 1940, Britain faced the threat of a German invasion, but the incursion would succeed only with air superiority. What followed was the first major campaign fought by opposing air forces. For 4 months, the German Luftwaffe carried out attacks on British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, and bombed British cities, too. But the Stukas proved too vulnerable to being intercepted, and the Germans couldn't mass enough planes to defeat the fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force in their Hurricanes and Spitfires. Heavy casualties forced the Luftwaffe to scale down operations. Hitler's invasion plans were put on hold indefinitely. Battle of Sedan, May 1940. When Britain and France declared war on Germany following the Nazi invasion of Poland, many expected that war to be a retread of the infantry tactics of World War I. That line of thinking clearly led to the French strategy of constructing the heavy concrete fortifications of the Maginot Line. Those expectations were shattered in May 1940, when the Germans launched a fast-paced blitzkrieg, lightning war, spearheaded by panzer tanks. Lacking heavy artillery, the Germans attacked French positions at Sedan with massed Stuka dive bombers. The intense air assault quickly demoralized the defenders and the German forces easily broke through. France fell soon afterwards. Battle of Brody, June 1941. Hitler's plan to attack Soviet Russia was called Operation Barbarossa, and it sure looked wild on paper, given the Russian numerical superiority and the ignominious history of enemy forces invading Russia. Hitler, however, believed the Blitzkrieg was unstoppable, and the Battle of Brody in western Ukraine would prove him right, for a time. 750 German panzers faced 4 times as many Russian tanks. But the Russian Air Force had been annihilated on the ground, and the German Stukas were able to dominate the area. In addition to destroying tanks, they targeted Russian fuel and ammunition supplies and disrupted communications. The confused Russian forces were completely outmaneuvered, and their numerical superiority made no difference. Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944. The largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf off the coast of the Philippines, was another step in the U.S. advance toward the Japanese home islands. All available Japanese forces were thrown into the area, but the separate units failed to unite, resulting in several actions scattered over a wide area. All 4 Japanese light carriers were sunk, as were 3 battleships. Leyte Gulf also marked the first use of a desperate new tactic. The escort carrier USS St. Louis was sunk after a Japanese kamikaze carrying a bomb deliberately crashed on its deck. Battle of the Atlantic, September 1939 to May 1943. Submarine warfare had some impact in the First World War, but became vastly more significant in World War II as the German U-boat packs aimed to blockade Europe. Merchant ships took to sailing in large convoys, protected by screens of destroyers and corvettes armed with depth charges and sonar. Daring U-boat commanders carried out torpedo attacks within the defensive screen, and when several submarines attacked at once, the defenders had little chance of striking back. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was eventually won by technology. Radar to detect U-boats from the surface, radio interception, and code breaking all played a part. By the end of the war, more than 3,000 merchant ships had been sunk, as well as almost 800 U-boats. Battle of the Coral Sea, May 1942. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese aimed to invade New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. U.S. forces, aided by some Australian ships, moved to intercept them. This produced the first naval battle fought at long range between aircraft carriers. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked ships protected by screens of fighters. It was a novel and confusing form of warfare, with both sides struggling to find the enemy, and unclear about which ships they had seen and engaged. The most serious loss was the American carrier USS Lexington, scuttled after catching fire. The fight forced Japan to call off its invasion plans. Battle of Luzon, January–August 1945. Luzon, the largest of the Philippine Islands, fell to Japan in 1942. General Douglas MacArthur had famously vowed to return to the Philippines, which he saw as strategically vital, and commanded the invasion force in 1945. The Allied landings were unopposed, but further inland, there was heavy fighting against scattered enclaves of Japanese troops. Some of them withdrew to the mountains and continued fighting long after the end of the war. Japan suffered extreme losses, with more than 200,000 killed compared to 10,000 Americans, making it the bloodiest action involving U.S. forces. Second Battle of Kharkov, May 1942. Stalin aimed to drive back the invading German armies with an offensive that included more than 1,000 tanks backed by 700 aircraft. But Germany blunted the attack by air power when it flew more than 900 planes into the area. The Germans then went on the attack and encircled the Russian forces with several panzer divisions. Trapped, surrounded, and with German bombers raining explosives down on them, Russian soldiers surrendered in large numbers. More than 250,000 Russian soldiers were killed, injured, or captured, 10 times the number of German casualties. Battle of Berlin, April or May 1945. To those in the West, the Battle of Berlin may seem like an afterthought, the death throes of a war already decided. In fact, it was a massive and extreme bloody action, as 750,000 German troops, under the personal command of Hitler, fought a desperate final defense against the encroaching Red Army. The Russians had the advantage in tanks, but armored vehicles were vulnerable to new portable anti-tank rockets that destroyed 2,000 of them. Like Stalingrad, the Battle of Berlin was an infantry action fought at close quarters. Artillery demolished defensive strongpoints in a city already devastated by heavy bombing. Casualties were heavy, including thousands of civilians. On the 30th of April, Hitler killed himself rather than surrender, effectively ending the war in Europe. Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. The last great carrier battle of World War II, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, happened as U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific. A Japanese force, including 5 large fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, plus some land-based aircraft, fought 7 U.S. fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. The U.S. enjoyed not only numerical superiority, but also vastly better aircraft. The new Grumman F-6F Hellcats outclassed the old Japanese Zeros. This disparity led to the action being nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, with about 4 times as many Japanese planes downed as American. Battle of Kursk, July–August 1943. Operation Citadel was the final German offensive on the Eastern Front, and Kursk is considered the greatest tank battle of the war. At Kursk, the Nazis aimed to repeat their earlier successes by surrounding and destroying Russian forces. Thanks to Allied codebreakers, though, the Russians got advance warning and built up defensive lines of ditches and minefields to absorb the German attack. In the air, Stukas armed with 37mm gun pods faced Russian armored Sturmovix, dropping dozens of anti-tank bombs. As the German offensive stalled, Marshal Zhukov launched his counterattack and drove the Germans back with heavy losses. D-Day, June 1944. The largest amphibious operation in history involved more than 5,000 ships landing Allied troops on a heavily defended 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline, while thousands more took part in an airborne assault. A major deception operation fooled the Germans into thinking that the landings were a feint, and resistance was light at 4 out of 5 landing sites. On the 5th, Omaha Beach, U.S. forces came under heavy fire and 2,000 died as they fought to break out of the beachhead. The Germans failed to organize rapidly to meet the threat. Within a week, the Allies had landed more than 300,000 troops in Normandy. Battle of Moscow, October 1941 to January 1942. More than 1 million German troops were thrown into the attack on Moscow, as Hitler ordered that the city should be razed to the ground rather than captured. At first, the German progress was rapid. By November 15 of 1941, they had fought to within 18 miles of the city. Then, they were slowed by the Russian resistance, and an early winter set in, with temperatures dropping well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The German supply chain failed, and Russian Marshal Zhukov threw his reserve of Siberian divisions into a counterattack. By January, the Germans were pushed back by more than 100 miles. Russian casualties were heavy, but the German momentum was broken. Battle of Midway, June 1942. Midway was a catastrophic defeat from which the Imperial Japanese Navy never fully recovered. Much of the credit goes to the codebreakers who revealed the Japanese plan to ambush U.S. forces in time for the Allies to plan a counter-ambush. The Japanese plan to split American forces also failed. The U.S. then launched a major air assault on the Japanese carriers. The TBF Avenger torpedo bombers were intercepted by Japanese Zeros and decimated, but the SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacking afterward got through. They arrived just as the Japanese planes were refueling and rearming on deck. 3 of 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed, tilting the course of the war against Japan. Battle of Stalingrad, August 1942 to February 1943. In contrast to the great sweeping tank battles elsewhere on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad was protracted and bloody urban warfare fought from street to street, house to house, and room to room as the Red Army resisted German attempts to take the city. Russia's defenses were based on thousands of strongpoints, each manned by an infantry squad, in apartments, office buildings, and factories, all with strict orders forbidding retreat. German artillery and air power virtually demolished the city, but failed to dislodge the defenders. Eventually, the German force was itself surrounded. The total number of casualties may have been as many as 2 million, including civilians. World War II is the bloodiest conflict in history. These are the 30 most important battles and operations that took place between 1939 and 1945. World War II was the bloodiest conflict in history, and it was carried out on a scale almost impossible to grasp. In many ways, it was the first modern war in which air power played a vital role both on land and at sea, though many World War II battles were ultimately won through the sheer determination and grit of the foot soldier. With that in mind, we rounded up the vast panoramic epic of World War II, presented in installments of its most noteworthy major battles.